In this video, we're going to be talking about progressive tendon loading exercises for Achilles tendinopathy. Even more, we'll go through exactly which exercises to give patients every step of the way, how to introduce plyometrics, how to make sure you're giving enough load to be able to progress them through care, and how to return them to running. So let's get talking about all this exciting information, right? So my name is Dr. Justin Jolene. I'm a PT and a total running nerd. I love doing running gait analysis with cash-based running gait analysis clinic, and I also teach future PTs as well. It's really my passion to be able to help PTs learn how to work with runners because let's face it, not enough of us know how to really help runners and really get them great results. So let's talk about what we'll learn in this video today. So we'll go over using progressive tendon loading exercises for Achilles tendinopathy. We'll also talk about the steps in progress of Achilles tendinopathy rehab, including isometrics, isotonics, heavy slow resistance training, and plyometrics. Then we'll get into the 4 tiers of progressive tendon loading exercises and talk about what are high and low load exercises. Now, I first want to clarify one thing. The goal of progressive tendon loading is to increase the tendon's capacity to tolerate load or activity. And I am saying that verbatim because this is a really important part of it. It's not necessarily to improve strength. What we're doing is we're incrementally adding more load with each exercise to be able to get the tendon to accept all that load we're putting on it. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're going to gradually and incrementally add more stressful exercises. We're going to help the tendon get more tolerant to that while still limiting the inflammation. That's key. We don't want inflammation to get too high. So we want to add progressive tendon loading exercises to incrementally give them harder things to do. And what does that really look like? Well, there's a 4-step process that we follow for Achilles tendinopathy. And that's going to be for progressive tendon loading. We start with load management. So we're going to bring them off some activity, calm down the issues. And around this time, we can start some isometric exercises as well. Now, we also see that we can start isotonics here as well, but some patients aren't going to tolerate it. So I'm putting it in step 2. Step 2 is going to be your isotonics. That's going to be your seated heel raises maybe. We'll get into those specifics. And then in step 3, after a lot of strengthening and a really good strengthening with isotonics, we're going to move those isotonics to be heavy, slow resistance loading. So that's going to be your weighted high resistance activity. Remember, slow here is key because we're keeping the speed low, we're keeping activity low, because then we want to quicken the activity, speed it up, introduce plyometrics. And that's going to be our time. We're going to get more dynamic motions. We're also going to capitalize on being able to stretch and shorten the tendon to be able to get more power out of it. And all of that's going to help us successfully return to running. So before we go any further, I want to tell you about something cool. So there's 2 things that you can grab from Solutions Education or all this continuing education content aimed at helping runners. And that's going to be the RCS certification, which is going to be your step-by-step process of how to analyze running gait and also how to treat patients and start your own very running gait analysis clinic. And then there's also the running specialist report, which is going to take all the latest information, all the latest research in running medicine, condense it down into an easy to read report, and then also give you continual updates. So it's a monthly thing. You get 2 reports a month and it's really cool. So hang around, and at the end, I'll tell you how you can get some samples and access to this stuff without even doing anything, and check out some of the cool information that's out there. So let's first talk about load management when it comes to Achilles tendinopathy. So Achilles tendinopathy rehab should start with a period of load management. Really, we want the tendon to be able to heal. So in this case, we're going to reduce running. We're going to potentially limit walking. Maybe up and down hills is limited too. What we want to do is have these patients reduce their load enough that their tendon can actually heal. And you might say to yourself, well, what is reducing load enough? We want their pain levels to be between 0 to 3 out of 10, either during exercise or activity and 24 hours afterwards. Now, that's an acceptable range that the tendon can still recover, because beyond that, the tendon starts to potentially get inflamed, calm back down, and kind of maintain this level of inflammation, pathology, tendinopathy that is not going to actually get them better. So a really good conversation with the patient about limiting their activities is going to be really important. Also, heel lifts have been found to be effective too. It's a little bit of a shortcut, it shortens the Achilles, but research has found it to be helpful. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, do I just tell my patient to rest completely? Do I just take them off all activity? Well, no. Achilles tendon load capacity will reduce with just complete rest. Then that's going to lengthen recovery. So we do want them to do as much as they can as long as they're not getting injured, as long as they're not getting inflamed. And the way we can understand this and be able to test patients to figure out what load their Achilles can take is going to be the single leg heel raise test. And this is how you're going to do it. The standardized single leg heel raise test is going to be a very important protocol to follow. What you can do is have patients go through this and see if they're getting inflammation, if they're getting pain, not only at the time, but you want to monitor them for that 24 hours after as well. Now, one of the key things about it is going to be that you want to keep the speed low. And I want to note here that this is the single leg heel raise test, but let's say a patient can't tolerate single leg heel raises, have them do double leg heel raises. If they can't tolerate that, have them do seated double leg heel raises. If they can't tolerate that, potentially get them going on some isometrics, although the research is a little bit lacking there. That's a high amount of inflammation. That is a little bit of a specific case. So for our runners with Achilles tendinopathy, we want to test their load tolerance in their tendon with a standardized heel leg raise test. And what we're going to do is we're going to have them start at 60 beats per minute. So that's 30 reps per minute. We want them to get into full plantar flexion range of motion. And we ought to all agree we want the knee to remain straight. We don't want the hips to compensate. We don't want the trunk to lean. We don't want any compensations. Now, a flat surface is best. Some people like to do it on a step. Really, whatever surface you're consistent with is the important surface to use. I recommend using a flat surface. And when footwear is needed to be consistent, you can use it. However, barefoot really provides the best results. Now, the reason I'm recommending all this is because research is pretty clear on this, that we see 12 less reps on average when someone's doing a standardized heel raise like we're outlining here. Because at that slow of a pace, we are not incorporating the stretch shortening cycle. That's going to make it so they're not really capitalizing on lengthening the tendon and then capitalize on that power storage to then contract a more powerful contraction back up. We've seen these patients that can do rebounding heel raises that can just do a ton in a row. That is not what we want. We want to see the load tolerance and the plantar flexion strength that's available here. And then also that slow resistance, really from the standardized heel raise test, we want to understand how they can perform under our slow conditions to be able to then understand if we can progress them to plyometrics down the road. So what does our first phase of our progressive tendon loading process look like? Remember, we have those steps. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. We are going to start at that isometric load management phase. And you'll notice I'm putting in here and or isotonic exercise. Here's a really important point that came up recently in the research. Years ago, Ebony Rio found that isometric exercises early on were really effective and they were helpful to be able to decrease pain levels. Now, we have seen some mixed research since then, basically saying that some patients have an increase in pain, some people don't have pain, and it can be an effective way to use isometrics. Calm down pain, who wouldn't say that's a good idea? Now, her prescription and what she found in her research was doing 5 sets of 45 seconds at 70% MVIC, so max volitional isometric contraction, and it improves pain levels. Now, this is really encouraging research. Now, as I mentioned, some people didn't improve their pain levels. So what we recommend is that we start isometrics and isotonics immediately. Now, what we also say is we start those isotonics at a low intensity, duration, and frequency. And I want to break down all these different variables of exercise that we can think of, because this is where our clinical reasoning really comes into play. We want to think about what the patient can do, capitalize on what they can do without pain or minimal pain, and then be able to progress it to get the tendon more load capacity. So let me show you what that looks like. So we break down progressive tendon loading into all these different categories. Intensity, or how much weight or how hard that contraction is going to be. Duration, how long the tendon is going to be under load. Frequency, so how often are you doing it per week or per day. The loading rate, so the speed of the contraction, And then the joint angle is really important too. Dorsiflexion for Achilles tendinopathy, especially insertional Achilles tendinopathy, is going to be a lot different than a neutral position, because that dorsiflexion position potentially is going to cause some compression of that tendon, and that compression of that tendon is then going to ultimately cause more inflammation as well. We want to be careful with the compression from the calcaneus on our Achilles tendon, so we want to find the variable that we can improve. Now, I don't recommend starting with loading rate and making really quick contractions to start with. That is oftentimes one of the surefire ways to flare up Achilles tendinopathy. However, what we can do is increase duration. Let's say we can have them do an isometric contraction for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds in the start. Progress it to 20, progress it to 30, progress it to 45. Also increase the weight level too. Maybe they can do double leg heel raises. We move that to single leg heel raises and we progress it that way. And then frequency. Maybe we can only tolerate one exercise session a week if they're really flared up. Or maybe they can do multiple a day. Whatever it is, you can play with these different variables to figure out what we can do for the patient to be able to help progress and help them get more progressive tendon loading. So what is a really good progressive loading exercise for heel raises? What's our progression here? Well, we're going to think of our 3 steps in this case. And the reason I say 3 steps is because we're going to divide our early rehab really into isometric and isotonics. Then we get into our heavy, slow resistance training. And then we get into our late stage, our plyometrics, things like that. So early on, isometric heel raises is going to be a good option. And let's say you have a patient that is a moderate intensity case or a moderately affected case. They can do some heel raises, maybe single leg for a prolonged amount of time. And then we also want to give them some isotonics too. So some slow resistance training. So heel raises, again, you're noticing here I'm putting 60 beats per minute because we want to keep it slow. Start with low reps and sets, progress from double to single leg. And a good goal for step 1 is going to be that they can do a single leg heel raise, 3 sets of 15 repetitions max without pain. So they're getting to approximately 15 until they're fatigued. They'll be able to do that 3 times. Then we progress them to step 2. That's going to be successfully completing step 1, obviously, but that's going to be higher, heavier, slow resistance training with the heel raises. We're going to add weight. Then we're going to want to progress that repetitions max from 3 sets of 15 to 3 sets of 6. So higher weight, higher intensity, but that progression, 6 repetitions max 3 times, is a really, really good goal to shoot for when it comes to heavy, slow resistance training, especially in our progressive tendon loading exercises, especially for heel raises. So our heel raises are at 3 sets of 6 repetitions max with weight, and then we can get them to be a little bit faster, not weighted as much in the beginning, and then we want to transfer to our plyometrics. Now, a quick note on plyometrics: we don't want to do plyometrics until the patient has adequate hip, knee stability. We want to be very careful of those things because that can add more load to the Achilles, and it also can make it so plyometrics are quite dangerous and it can create other pathology. The other thing that we can consider early on are running drills, even a squat jump, which I wouldn't consider a plyometric. I'd say it's an isolated strengthening exercise that includes a jumping activity. But when I really think of plyometrics, I'm thinking to myself, multiple jumps in a row, and they're also at a higher rate of speed. So as we get into some of those things, we can talk about what different drills we might consider for our patients to do every step of the way. Now, Achilles tendinopathy exercise prescription. So as I mentioned before, the Achilles tendinopathy exercises are really ranked into 4 tiers of tendon loading. So Achilles tendon loading is really multifactorial. There's a load index, which is really easy to think of 1 number. And I'm going to show you the graph here in just a second. But the load index is going to incorporate the loading peak, the loading rate, and the loading impulse. And what I want you to remember here is that the load that's being placed on the Achilles tendon goes back to that diagram we saw earlier. All of these variables can be changed. So the loading peak is how much intensity, maybe how much weight, what type of exercise you're doing, double leg, single leg. Then the loading rate, how fast you're doing it, how quick the load is added or applied to the tendon. And then the impulse, the total time the tendon is under load. That's important because an exercise might be a lower intensity exercise, maybe has a lower loading peak, maybe even a lower loading rate, but it's a really long exercise. We want to think about how that's going to affect the patient. So in the beginning, we want to prioritize exercises with low loading peaks. It's going to decrease flare-ups. That's going to make it easier for patients to do. And then we want to progress them by slowly adding impulse and slowly adding loading rate as well. Plyometric exercises are going to have the highest loading rate. So we want to be, again, careful with that. Now, I want to just say this one more time, that in the beginning, we want to prioritize those exercises that are going to be a low loading peak. It's going to limit flare-ups, as I mentioned before. Then we're going to increase the time the tendon is under load. We're also going to increase the rate as well, because we do know those plyometric exercises have the highest rate of load, and that is going to be important to think about. They also have moderate peak loads. So we can see their peak load isn't that high when it looks at their overall load index. However, the rate at which this is applied is quite high, which could be irritating for Achilles tendinopathy. Now I want to pause here just for 1 second and tell you about something cool again. So for the running specialist report, we really go over the latest research in running medicine. We talk about it and we condense it down into these easy to read reports so that you can get better results with runners and can truly understand what is out there and what's going on with the latest evidence-based practice. Saves you time, saves you energy. Who wants to read through all the research articles? This is why it's there for you. Now go ahead and check it out. There's a sample that you can grab of a previous report, and also you can get a complimentary 7-day trial. I'll take a link and I'll put a link for you so you can find it. So go ahead, don't miss that, and don't miss out on this essential resource that will help you improve runners' outcomes. Now back to all of our great content here. So Achilles tendinopathy Tier 1 exercises. Let's go through each of these. So Tier 1 is going to be our seated heel raises. That's going to be about our lowest, and this is going to be loading peak that we're talking about here. Then we're going to progress it to seated heel raises with one leg, and as you can see, we go up the chain here with going ahead and standing at standing heel raises. So these are going to all be dynamic motions. You can also look at things like squats are going to be multiple joints, and that's going to be something that can start to prep some of the other muscles, hips, knee stabilizers as well in this process. Now I do want to note one more time that low tendon loading peaks are good to start with, and seated is going to be less than standing. And these are going to also be done isometrically as well. So we can do these with a prolonged hold time instead to be able to improve and get patients to tolerate them better. Now Tier 2 exercises change things up a little bit. Tier 2 is going to have a lot of variability. As you can see here, we do things like rebounding heel raises. And you can see here there's things like jumps, jumping forward, and standing heel raises on one leg. Now again, I'm identifying the loading peak here. So the loading peak, as you can see, for some of these jumping exercises isn't that high. However, these are multiple movements. Some of them are going to be higher and faster, and we want to be cognizant that they might be a quicker loading rate. So a couple notes on that. Plyometric exercises don't have a high peak load, but have a very fast loading rate. So we want to think about that there's a different range of exercises here. A lot of them include multi-joint movements like lunges, and also start to introduce things like plyometrics. And you might be saying, well, didn't you say to strengthen them with heavy resistance before plyometrics? Yes, we do, because there's a variability in the loading peak. Remember, we're just talking about loading peak here with these exercises. But I do want to point out and say that these plyometric exercises can be considered a little earlier on, but there's a lot of variability among patients. Some patients have a high pain response with some of these plyometric exercises. Others have a fairly low one. So I would recommend, and the research would recommend, that practitioners use weighted heel raises to really strengthen the plantar flexors before we add significant plyometric load. And that gets into what the plyometrics are going to do and the biomechanics of plyometrics. We want to make sure people are doing plyometrics correctly and in a safe way. Because Tier 3 gets into some of our complex motions. Now we're talking about drop jumps. Now we're talking about counter movement jumps and forward jumps on a single leg. That's a pretty high load. We're talking about a high loading peak here. And as you can see, these exercises are getting to about the equivalent of a run stance. So this is really starting to add more load to our Achilles tendon here and higher levels of progression. But before starting those plyometrics, remember, we want to have adequate hip and knee stability, and so many patients are doing plyometrics wrong. We want to be mindful, particularly with plyometrics, of the ground contact time. Now, increasing the ground contact time is going to help patients maintain proper form, and also it's going to help them do their plyometrics correctly, because it's going to break up the eccentric and concentric phase of the jumping or plyometric exercise, which is then going to help them ultimately get those mechanics down, get the impact loading and explosiveness of the activity down so they have it correct before they ever get into higher levels of plyometrics. So always start slower, progressing to faster, and even breaking down into the impact load and the concentric explosion of the activity in the plyometric as well. Now, sometimes tier 3 exercises may be eligible to start a return to run program, but we'd want to take patients through a hop cluster. We'd want to take them through a max hop test to understand where they're at. We'd want to maybe take them through a Y balance test as well, and compare with an LSI, a limb symmetry index, to be 90% of the other leg to make sure they have enough strength and enough tolerance to be able to run. We also want to consider our load test of single leg heel raises, potentially, depending on their goals, underweight or under higher load. And then you have tier 4 exercises, which starts to get into different patients' goals. Some patients are going to want to go trail running or competitive running. You might have them do this with high weight, or maybe you just need to get them to hopping single leg, and that's enough to get them back to running. A lot of the patients that are running are going to need a significant amount of load and strength through these Achilles tendinopathy progressive tendon loading exercises. So most of them are going to get to these forward hops and make sure that they have enough strength to be able to do that. But with tier 4, again, remember, what is the patient's goals? Trail running, competitive running? Now, since these higher load exercises are highly symptomatic, it's important to vary the exercise sessions throughout the week. Have an easier loading day, a medium loading day, and a higher intensity loading day. Especially if you're putting in a return to run program, you may want to consider a run day, maybe with some very easy exercises, a medium intensity day where they're doing most of the strengthening and plyometric exercises, and then a higher intensity day where they're doing heavy, slow resistance training, maybe plyometrics as well, or maybe even doing part of the return to run plan as well. You can form it based on the patient's needs and tolerance, but you want to think about how much load you're giving them and not just give them an unprecedented amount of things to do, because then their follow through might be pretty poor as well. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you learned something about Achilles tendinopathy and progressive tendon loading and how we're using that for Achilles tendinopathy. Feel free to ask any questions, and until next time, take care.